All right, so I see we have a couple of people joining here. So I just wanted to kick things off and say welcome everyone to today's Lunch and Learn. We have a full hour to answer or address any questions that might come up. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to come off mute and ask that question, or you can paste it or you can write that question into the chat feature or the Q&A feature. And Alex Potter, I see you have your hand raised. Did you have a question?
I do. Well, a couple kind of related things. So just as a point of clarification, like if I want to change a date based on some other action happening on a form, my understanding is that a data flow is basically the only avenue available to me. Is that correct?
Yeah, so let's kind of dive into that a little bit. So the use case would be you want a date to automatically be populated on a form?
Yeah. Well, based on some user action on the form.
Based on a user action on the form? Yeah, so a data flow, if you're using versions 6 or previous to 6, we have data flows that are available for that. That will populate data onto a form. But in version 7, we introduced something called active form flows, which it's the same concept. It's a flow running on your form that allows you to populate information. But within the active form flows feature, you also have the ability to not only populate data on your forms, but also do things such as set components if they're visible or not. You can run validation rules through that flow as well. So they're a little, an active form flow encompasses all of our old legacy data like flows, visibility rules.
Visibility, validation, and data flows kind of thing all wrapped up into one?
Exactly, yep. Would you be interested in taking a look at that?
Well, that's something that I'm going to look forward to, but like I'm, for the time being, stuck on in the version 6 world. I'm not sure when we're going to go to version 7, but yeah, if you want to demo that, that'd be great. But and also like to, I don't know if these things can kind of be. My other kind of question was in version 6 again on a date picker. There's an attribute that's available to check, which allows me to specify the format of the date, basically using the .NET rigmarole like MMM, that sort of stuff. But I don't see anything like that on the date time picker, and I'm wondering how one goes about doing that for the date time picker.
I don't know if I've ever actually taken a look at that. Let me go ahead and create a form and we can take a look at that. Corey, do you happen to know off the top of your head, or anybody on this call who's joined with me, if that's an option?
I don't, for the date times picker specifically, I don't know if that is something that you change on the date picker or on the form component, or whether that's governed by the culture that the account that's logged in, if that's changed in that manner. It's something that we can definitely follow up on.
So if you also drag like just a date picker, Jessica, you'll see in the setup data of the date picker that there is a checkbox for specifying your, see right there, override date format. And now I get to do like mm/dd/yyyy or whatever I want to do. And that basically has the effect of changing, because I get it that there's a setting at the host level that's going to determine, generally speaking, what happens for the culture. But so I'm just kind of trying to figure out how I get this behavior on the control just above it.
I see. Okay, that is definitely something that we can dig into and see if maybe that's a feature request that we can put in for.
Okay.
Let me take note of that. All right, great. Now what I can do is, Alex, we do have, I'd be happy to demo the active form flows right now and just kind of show you, give you a sneak peek into what that looks like. But I will also mention that next Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern time, we're going to have a webinar that's fully dedicated to the active form flows. But I could go ahead and give you a peek into that now.
Yeah, that'd be great, because I did see that come up in my email this morning, and regretfully, I mean, not entirely regretfully, but June 24th is our national holiday here in Quebec.
Well, we'll make sure that it gets recorded. They're recorded and it will be on that website.
Okay, great.
All right, so what I'm going to do, I'm just going to build, just to kind of show in the active form flow that you can not only populate data, but you can also use like a visibility rule. I'm going to just build something really simple. It's a silly example here, just something that came to the top of my head. I'm just going to build something where if I type in the name Jessica, then in this first name component, then we'll have a second text box here for last name that will then become visible, and then will populate with the name of my last name of Potter. So let me go ahead and just do some setup here. We're going to call this our first name text box. This will be our last name text box. Okay, great. We'll add our last name label. And I'm just going to make sure I change the actual names of these components, and you'll see why in just a moment when we get into that active form flow. Let me call this our first name label. Make sure I have a label on this as well. And we'll go ahead and change this to say first name. All right, so what I'm going to do is maybe we don't want these visible right off the bat. Maybe we want some sort of parameter to say if they're visible or not. So I'm going to go ahead and just mark this as not visible. Well, actually, you know what? I can just do it in the flow. That's fine. All right, so now that we have our component here, our active form flows, if I go to the right-hand side of the properties panel, here's our active form flows option. And when I go to add a new flow, we'll just call this our example form flow. When I go in to actually build the flow, so one of the really cool things with these active form flows is when I go into the data explorer, the data that I have available to me is going to be all of the information on that form. So this flow is already going to be aware of all of the different components that are on that form. So that's something that's new. You don't have to define inputs or outputs to the data flows. You don't have to, well, you do have to define an output, but you don't have to define inputs to the flows or rules. It's all going to be available for you already.
All right.
So now what I'll do is we'll just build a rule here that says, we'll just make it simple, string equals. So we'll say if whatever value that comes in from our first name text box. So when I click first name text box, you'll see all of the different properties. Is it enabled? Is it, what's the value that's in there? Is it visible? So I'm going to select value, and we'll say if the value for the first name text box equals Jessica, Then what we'll do is I'm just going to use a create data step here to populate what the data should be on the output. So we're going to populate our last name. And we're going to say we'll populate it with Potter. And then now one of the important things that I'm going to have to do is I'm creating the data of Potter. But what I want to do is I want to change the value of the form data. So on the output of this create data, what I'm going to do is I'm going to select change value here, and I'm going to change the existing form data that's coming into this flow. And in a minute, this will kind of make sense when I get to the output of the form. So I'm going to come to my last name text box here, and what we're going to do is we're just going to update the value of the last name text box with Potter. There we go. What we'll also do too is we'll say should text box or last name label. What we're going to do, and what I'm doing with this create data step, is just deciding if the last name label and the last name text box should be visible or not, so we can update those values. So these are going to be Booleans. And Alex, feel free to stop me at any time if you have any questions about what I'm doing.
Okay.
So we're going to mark both of these as true. We want to show it, the label and the text box. And then what I'm going to do is, again, we're just going to change the value of the existing form data. So we'll go into, let's see, this is our last name label. We'll say, yep, let's make that visible if it goes down that true path. Same thing for the text box. So I'll go back into form data. I'll pick my last name text box. And yes, we want to make that visible. There we go. Awesome. And then on the false path, I'm going to go ahead and just copy this so I don't have to retype everything. If it doesn't equal Jessica, we're just going to ignore any inputs. We want to make sure that the label and the text box are now not visible. There we go. So I'll just leave it that way. And then what I'm going to do is on the end step of this, I'm just going to now define the form data as the output. So since we're updating all of the values using these steps, we're just going to pass that entire form data object back to the form itself. So I'll go ahead and hit save here. And then I want to run it at startup because I want to make sure I'm hiding that last name if it shouldn't be shown. But then I also want to trigger it anytime maybe a value changes in the first name text box. All right, so now we have that set up. Let's go ahead and debug this. So we'll drop it in a flow so we can actually test it. And clearly I have very creative names today. So I'll just drag my show form step here. We'll pick the form we just built. We'll go ahead and just, well, we'll leave this one. All right, so when we jump into the debugger here, right off the bat, you can see that rule flow is going to run because I told it to run at startup. So we can see because there was no value in there, it didn't equal Jessica. So it's going to set all of the visibilities, or it's going to set that last name text box and component or label to not be visible. But now if I go in here, type in Jessica, you can see within the same active form flow, I now am populating data, and at the same time, I'm using visibility rules. So with the new active form flows, you have a way to encompass all of that logic within a single flow.
Yeah, this is great.
Awesome, awesome. Yeah, I was really excited about them as well when I saw it.
Things to look forward to. Great, thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Do we have any other questions that have come in? Let me check my chat here. And Alex, I think I tell you this every single time I get on a call with you. I know I've been through training with you and a couple of webinars, but I am a big fan of your last name because that's my last name too. And I'm going to continue to tell you that every time I see you.
Potter to Potter.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. It's yeah, I don't you know, other than obviously Harry, our brother, but you know.
Yeah. Yes. Alex, I think I put you higher in my book than Harry because you use decisions.
Yeah.
All right, looks like we have another question that has come in. So this is from Carlos. So regarding the activity panel, the control that appears on the right side, for example, in the case entities, I would like to know which CSS or script elements I must edit so that the vertical line of the corresponding timeline can be seen within a state. Currently, by default, individual panels are seen for each activity or comment that appears within the states. Okay, Carlos, I'm going to take a moment to unpack this question. I'm just going to reread it silently to myself. Okay, so what I'm going to do, Carlos, feel free to come off mute as well, but let me go to a page that has an activity panel so we can kind of unpack this together.
Okay.
All right, so this is an activity panel that is for a flow execution extension, but I think we can still kind of talk through it here. All right, so let's see. When you say the vertical, let me find it, the vertical line of the corresponding timeline can be seen within a state.
Yes.
Are you referring to this right here?
Not this one. In exchange of that, of this, in some samples that appears in the decisions documentation from before, you can see that the icons, for instance, that you have in the left side of the activity panel, between them, there is a vertical line and not the horizontal line you see now here. You know, that shows that what happened after this and after this and after that. You see three icons there: the policy details, the foster draft, PDF, and the 50% complete.
Mm-hmm.
In the model I am tell you, it can be a vertical line that is attached to each one of those three icons. Then you see the continuity of something of a conversation. Not these horizontal lines, just the vertical line. You can see in a lot of documentation in decision models, but not now. Not
Okay. So let me go ahead and just create a case real quick, because I think this dashboard might already have some CSS on it. So let's do something from scratch, just so that we can actually take a look. So bear with me one moment here. I'm going to create a case. Just going to add one field to it here. And then I'll just add, I'll build a flow that just creates one, and then we'll send it through a couple of different states just so that we can kind of. Oops. Okay. All right, so just a couple more things to do. Create my folder to send my cases to. All right, I'll create my flow to create my case. Oops. All right, and then I'm just going to grab a set entity state to send it to another state, just so we can kind of see that movement. And maybe we'll send it to a second state as well. All right, so let me go ahead and debug this real quick, and then we should have something to look at. All right. So are you talking about this activity view?
This is the activity view, but what I want to see is when, for instance, you have one activity which is that the name started, the started assignment. If something happened again in a new step inside the started state, you can see a line between the first icon and the new icon that will appear. Just a line, not a horizontal line, the vertical line between icons, touching icons. I am looking here for samples, but I don't find because I didn't prepare this question. Just
Hey, Jessica.
Yes, Corey.
Can we click on the runtime case
Yes.
view for this? Is this the view that you're looking for, Carlos?
No. I understand this is another type of view. When I say icon, I am talking about the design, which is at the left side near the word name. This is the icon. And when I am talking the line, is a line that starts vertically on this icon and touch the new icon that appear in a new activity inside this state. It's not shown. For the explanation, I need two activities to explain that. It is only one activity in the started stage.
Okay, I can go throw an add comment step in there. Oh.
You can add it at the activity panel as well.
That's true. Good
So we
call.
don't have to create a new one. So are you asking more for where do these icons of, under the started state, we have that first assignment where it's that checkbox in the circle, and this comment has this speech bubble. Is your question about where do those icons, where are they referenced such that when they appear as items within the activity panel, that these icons are related to this entity?
In my question, those bubbles are in the correct side, but the line is not in the correct side for what I want. You see a line, an horizontal line. And in the other model that I am talking about, you can see a line between the two bubbles, from one bubble to the other bubble, a vertical line.
So a line like this, going this way?
Yes, like a typical timeline that currently in general is used.
Gotcha. And you want to know what CSS element
to
edit to do that?
Because in decisions you have that. For a long time, I don't see that in the documentation, but in some samples you made that in that way.
One of the ways that we can, I don't know that off the top of my head, but Carlos, one of the things that you can do is you can use your developer tools, and you can use this select icon here and kind of hover over the different portions of this activity panel, and it will give you the element name.
Okay, and the horizontal line can be hide also, the one I see here between the two bubbles, the horizontal one, the line.
This line right here, that might doesn't look like something I'm able to select. But it might be, you know, part of this. When I have this selected, it might be either, you know, a bottom or top portion of that section. I'm not
Okay.
entirely sure.
Okay.
And I am also not admittedly, I'm not a CSS master, but I think this is the best approach to kind of figure out what that element name is, and then play with the CSS. I can talk to a couple of people internally who are great with CSS and see if they already know that, and we can follow up with you if we're able to find an answer.
Okay. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Right.
All right, I'll check to see if we have any more questions that have come in. Don't see any questions. I'll give everyone a couple more minutes to think of any questions if they have any. I don't see any more questions that have come in, but I will hang on the line for a few more moments here before we close it out, just to give anybody time to maybe type up their questions. Or again, if you want to come off mute, feel free to come off mute and ask anything. And as I'm giving people time to think through any questions they might have, I also just want to mention, for those of you who are new to the Lunch and Learn webinars, we do post all of the recordings on our YouTube channel. So, you know, feel free to check out any of our past Lunch and Learn recordings, or Alex and Carlos for any of your questions that have been answered. If you need to go back and reference it at any point, they are available on YouTube. And Martin, I see you have a question.
Hi, yes. I have a subflow that I'd like to throw an API exception on it if it happens that, you know, I need to.
Sure.
But on the parent flow, how can I capture that so that I can return a specific HTTP code, HTTP status code?
Sure. So if you, I'm just going to open up this, like, let's say this is I'm just going to, we'll just call this our parent flow. If I have a subflow that has a throw exception step, so let me just create one here. Call this our subflow. So if I have something that's happening here and some exception has been thrown, I'm just going to put a placeholder step here. And some exception has been thrown. If within this subflow there is no catch exception step, the exception that's thrown, if you have a catch exception step, if you have a catch exception step in the parent flow, that exception that's thrown will be caught within this parent flow and sent to this catch exception step. So then if you need to log any of that API error that came back, you can do something like add that exception message to the logs. Oops.
I think that works. My problem is
There we go.
once I'm using the API exception and I'm
Mhm.
setting up the specific status code that I want to return for that error, it's sort of turning it into a string instead of when catching the exception, it's turning it into a string instead of actually returning the status code that I want.
Gotcha. Jessica, can you drag over the throw API exception step? So to understand where you are, you're saying that the status code that's being returned by this particular step is not what you're, say, if you're calling this via Postman, that's not the status code that's being returned to Postman?
Correct. I have that throw API exception within the subflow. On the parent flow, I have exactly what Jessica just did, a catch exception step. When I call it and it runs into that exception, I'm not returned that status code that I set up within the step on that subflow.
Gotcha. Okay. I think that's interesting behavior, but I think that's just due to the flow kind of hitting that API exception and not knowing that it needs to return back that status code and bouncing up to or boiling up to that catch exception step. So we may need to add in either a rule at the next step after that catch exception to say, do I need to send back an API exception or not?
You mean to tie it so that it, because I don't on the parent flow, on the catch exception step, I don't see a way to return that status code.
Right.
Is there a way to sort of?
You would have, being in the nature of, that a catch exception step can be hit at any point during a flow. Like if we were to jump to this log step and we look at the view input or edit input mapping.
Sorry.
Yeah, the show editor works the same because it'll show us all of the flow data that this step could have access to. So if it does have access to, that status code, we could put that in here as well. Same with if we're to attach that throw API exception step here as well. What I'm hesitant about is if we're hitting that throw API exception, we're bubbling up to that catch exception step. I don't know the behavior if we hit that throw API exception step again, if it's just going to keep bouncing back and forth to the catch exception step. Does that make sense? And that might be something that we need our support team to look at with you to make sure that we're thinking through this in the right way.
If it's a single exception, you think it'll still bounce back and forth?
It
Like
could,
if I only have one, sorry, go ahead.
If the kind of the overarching nature of the catch exception step is to catch exceptions and to handle it more gracefully, I don't know if you can configure on that catch exception step to only catch exceptions that are thrown within subflows of this process. Jessica, can you click on the catch exception step? Let's actually drill in and see the properties of that. So we can check the box to avoid business rule exceptions, but I don't think there's the same checkbox to avoid API exceptions, because the throw API exception has that unique behavior of being able to send back that status code.
Right, so you're saying maybe avoid avoid catching it on the parent flow so that it can actually return the status code within the subflow?
I think I'll have to lean on support a little bit. I can't quite think through the right behavior right now.
All right, I'll reach out to the support team. That's fine. I just wanted to know if there was a different way to do this.
Yep.
Thank you.
All right, so we do have another question that came in from Carlos. So regarding credentials and API calls, can you explain a little bit the differences between login, named session, guest, session ID, user ID, password? Yeah, absolutely. All right. So if we come in here just to talk through some of them as we have something on our screen. So if we wanted to call this via API, if it's login, all that means is when a user goes to actually hit this API before that flow will run, it's going to require that user to actually log in, put in their username and their password. For guest, this is going to be using our guest account credentials. One thing to know with guest accounts, though, that the guest account is not enabled right out of the box on a clean install. It's something that you have to go into the system folder and actually enable that guest account. So what's going to happen there is guest is, again, just going to require, the guest is going to use the guest account credentials. Probably something that I wouldn't recommend as a API authentication, just because you know, multiple people could be using that guest account. Let's see what else we have here. Named session. So a named session is essentially going to function as kind of a lookup where a unique GUID, let me go ahead and just select a named session here. So when I select a named session, the body of the message that's being sent in to the API call is going to include this named session ID. And what's going to happen is when this named session ID comes in, Decisions is going to take a look at that ID, and then it's going to go look up the actual user credentials who are tied to that. So just to kind of tie that all together, when you're creating what you do to create a named session is you come into the system folder, you go to security, named sessions, create, add named session. So just give it a name.
Okay.
We'll call this Jessica's test. And then you pick the account that you actually want to tie that session to. So if you pick Brandon's account, that session ID that's being passed in is going to go look up Brandon's account credentials and see if Brandon has the ability to actually run that flow. And then let's see, we'll go back. What else do we have here? We have a session ID. Session ID is actually something that I have not ever used. I believe what a session ID is, it's going to use credentials of the current person who is logged into the account. Is anyone on the call with me able to confirm that if that's the case?
Can't confirm or deny.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. We'll look that up for you. And then user ID and password. What that's going to do, one, I would never recommend doing this, especially in production. What this is going to do is in the body of the message, it's actually going to pass in, or in the URL if it's a GET call, it's actually going to pass in that user's username as well as the password. So this is not secure. This is really just meant for testing purposes. But that's what the user ID and password is.
And Jessica, supposing you are giving a service to clients, and which is the best practice to define, because they consume services within these API calls, which is the best defined connection for this?
Sure. I would recommend using a named session. And it kind of depends on the way that you're exposing it to clients. So if, you know, does each client have their own login to decisions, or do they not have a login at all to decisions?
Suppose that,
or an account in decisions?
No, they do not navigate in this case. They only use the service of, suppose they look for a result of a rule or something, but nothing else.
Yeah, so what I would recommend there is creating an account, that, like a single account that isn't necessarily tied to a person, but maybe to that client, and making sure that particular account only has permissions to use that rule, or only has permissions to use that flow or that folder, and then creating a named session that's tied to that account.
Okay. Clear.
All right, we'll give everyone a couple more minutes here for some questions. All right, and it looks like Corey has posted something in the chat for you, Martin. And I'll just read it out loud for everybody, but essentially there is a developer task. Oh, okay, you got it, great. And I will spare you guys me reading. All right, and I'm gonna hand off the torch to Corey here as a host. If there's any more questions, thank you everyone so far. I really appreciate the questions that came in and the participation. But I'm gonna hand it over to Corey, and everyone have a great Thursday.
All right. I'll keep the line open for about a minute more. If I don't see any more questions, I will we'll call it for the day. All right, I'll go ahead and call it here. Thanks everybody for joining. Great questions. Hope we were able to answer a few questions today. And as always, thanks for having lunch with us. Bye now.